Well, I think racial tensions aren't new. I think they've risen before, so I don't think there's a sharp break with the past. I think part of it is that racial violence, particularly police violence, has received additional attention. I think cell phones have contributed to that. I think other forms of social media have made a kind of behavior that is not new seem more horrific and more graphic than in the past. So it's, I think people are more sensitive to it and more aware of it, and I think seeing something has a different effect than simply reading about it. And I think we see these events more, even if they don't necessarily occur at a startlingly higher rate than in the past. Police homicide isn't new. And the number of police killings was probably much greater in the past, but the courts and police departments have changed the rule, essentially the rules of engagement. The definition of self-defense by law enforcers has changed. Ideas about legal standards for shooting suspects have changed. There was a 1985 Supreme Court case that said that cops have to be more judicious in their use of deadly force against fleeing felons. So a lot of these changes have been going on, but they're complicated. And issues such as implicit bias and understaffing and distrust in all directions make some of these circumstances unstable. Law enforcement policing of African American communities has historically been uneven. Some odd combination of hyper-policing and under-policing. So more aggressive arrests, but slower responses, often because of funding shortages and the like, but it's a really dangerous mix. And more attention has to be made to those issues. More attention has to be made about police policies that contribute to the spiral. We know things like stop and frisk have been unconstitutional, but they're also horribly ineffective and racially biased, which is why New York's version of stop and frisk was found unconstitutional. So they didn't improve safety, but they increased tensions. And when those tensions increase, circumstances spiral out of control, and that increases the likelihood that there'll be deadly use of force in all directions. There's been a lot of attention, appropriately, to police-community relations. And part of the reason for that is that when those relations are most frayed, the potential for violence increases. But it's also the case that when, and there's enormous research on this, that when people don't think the police are responsive to them, they're less likely to call the police. There have been many, many studies by social psychologists and criminologists that have reached this conclusion. And if people don't call the police, or if they believe the police aren't responding to them, their communities are more likely to suffer from crime. They suffer from all sorts of problems, and that contributes to this spiral. As poor communities have greater crime, then the police are more anxious when they go into those neighborhoods. They're more jittery. The scholarly literature from social psychologists concludes that virtually everyone suffers from some level of implicit bias, and that causes people to think that the threats in front of them are even more pronounced and more dangerous, and that in turn leads people to use force much more than they might otherwise. So all these things interact with one another, and they contribute to a downward spiral, and part of it is perceptions of the relationship between the police and the community, and that's a really complicated issue. And there are strategies that seem to be helping community-oriented policing as one. There's another called the broken windows policy, in which the police respond to minor problems in the community, literally things like broken windows, to convey that They're trying to address problems, and that seems to help. But there's no single panacea. There's no answer. What I do think we know is that militarization, stop and frisk, law and order, those things contribute to the downward spiral rather than diffusing tensions between inner city communities, for example, and law enforcement. I think it's hard to offer an answer that covers every case. I think historically it certainly has been the case that the police are much more sensitive to the threats that patrolmen face and are much more inclined to say that that person seems sufficiently menacing that the officer feared for his or her life, and therefore the use of deadly force was justifiable. I think that's why it's important for civilian review boards and others to be involved in those decisions rather than it just being an internal matter. I think they're hard questions, but in the past, the default position has been that the police officer's actions were justifiable, and the Supreme Court and various lower courts have said that's not good enough anymore. But different states have different standards. Florida, for example, provides much more latitude for the definition of self-defense, and that's, quite frankly, I think that's frightening. If feeling fear justifies the use of deadly force, then an awful lot of young African-American men are going to be shot. And the courts or the review board is going to say it's justifiable. And not so many people like me, not so many middle-aged people, very few women are going to get shot, or the police officers who do that are unlikely to be justified, because a police officer approaching me is less likely to be frightened. And that's what social psychologists and neurophysiologists call implicit bias. It doesn't mean that the police officer is racist, but ideas about what's scary, about what's threatening, are informed. They're shaped by popular perceptions. Social psychologists call it ambient cultural forces. So if a 70-year-old white woman is virtually never perceived as threatening, and an 18-year-old African-American man is, and the definition of lawful self-defense has to do with how frightened the person holding the gun is, it's not surprising what the demographic breakdown of the victims of police homicide are. Well, recent research from neurophysiologists has focused on a structure in the subcortex of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is, in mammals, it's the early response system to fear. So you hear a loud noise. Immediately, there are physiological changes in your body happening much faster than you can process the information. And these are easily measurable. Your pulse increases, your heart rate increases, there's a surge of adrenaline, your blink impulse increases. And then very quickly afterward, cognitive networks in the brain kick in, because it takes them slightly longer, as in nanoseconds longer, to kick in. So you're asleep and you hear noise in your apartment. You wake up startled. Your muscles are tense. Your heart rate is increasing. Then very quickly you say to yourself, my cat just knocked over a pot, a plant. And then you're fine. Well, we know from neurophysiologists that you can put someone in a functional MRI chamber and you can show them scary images. And very quickly, fractions of a second, a functional MRI scan will reveal a surge from this structure in the brain called the amygdala. And that's what's telling your body to produce the adrenaline to increase the heart rate. We've known that for a while. What neurophysiologists and social psychologists have done in more recent years is they've shown photographs to a fairly broad cross-section of people in these who are undergoing functional MRI scans. What they found is that you show an elderly woman, nothing happens. You show a picture of me or you, nothing happens. You show the picture of a young African-American man, the amygdala lights up. There's a physiological change connected to fear. Now, very, very, very quickly, the person in that MRI chamber knows it's just a photograph. They don't act on it. But what it tells neurophysiologists is that the body is reacting. Physiologically, there's a reaction to things that society, newspapers, the movies, the media have said are frightening. Well, if you're someone in a circumstance where any unexpected thing can be deadly, you're a soldier in war, you may not have the same luxury as someone who wakes up in the middle of the night and realizes that their cat has knocked over a plant. So what implicit bias is the body saying danger, danger. Well, police officers and soldiers and firemen are often, too often, in circumstances that are potentially dangerous and unsettling. So if you're in that circumstance and you see an image that your body, no matter what your political leanings are, because the tests from neurophysiologists have found that even people who in their normal life show no signs of racial discrimination, their amygdala still responds to these images. So it seems clear that there's some level of implicit, of unconscious bias going on. It doesn't, again, this is not action, it's a physiological reaction. But you're a firefighter in a dangerous setting, you're a police officer, you're a soldier, you know that you need to act quickly. That's a formula for bad things happening to people who look a certain way. And until people understand that part of reducing police homicide is figuring out how to slow things down, so that the policeman responding to a 911 in a dark alley, how training can slow down their responses. By slow down, I mean the same way that elite professional quarterbacks are quick to say that as they've gotten more experience, the game has slowed down to them. They see more. And it's in that sense, I mean, slow down. So until there's some understanding in the way that people who find themselves in really dangerous circumstances process fear, there's still going to be too many bad outcomes to those things. And, I recently heard an interview with someone running for national office who basically denied that implicit bias exists. I don't know how you train law enforcers to deal with the complexity of their job if there's not an understanding that this is real, that this isn't some political witch hunt, and that the issue isn't right or wrong necessarily. It's training people to process information differently. And I think there are experiments with police training that suggest that it can be done. It really has to be done, though. I think it varies dramatically. I think there are some police departments that are very proactive. It's also the case that I think some of our understanding of implicit bias is pretty new. And as a consequence, I think figuring out how to deal with implicit bias isn't a simple thing. But I think a lot of police chiefs and a lot of police departments recognize that it's real and are trying to figure out what to do with it, what to do about it. There isn't, to my knowledge, a simple, easy fix. You can't just take a brief course. People in very tense, rapidly changing circumstances sometimes actually believe that they've seen things that aren't there. They're not making it up necessarily. So if the police approach me in a parking garage and ask me for identification, they will see my wallet. They're less likely to see your wallet. And if you are African American, again, there's a huge body of evidence on this, they're more likely to actually believe, they're not making this up, they're actually more likely to believe that they saw something metallic and shiny in your hand. The exact same circumstances, the same lighting, the same everything. What social psychologists argue is that visual images are constructed. We naively believe that you actually see what's in front of you. That's not always the case, and that's why eyewitness testimony is so flawed. The way the human brain processes information, people's brains sometimes get ahead of what's actually there. And depending on who's involved and what's the circumstances, they're more likely to see what they fear they're going to see. Literally for 100 years, civil rights and social justice activists have argued that shedding light on these problems, that making them into political issues, will help to resolve the issue, or at least reduce the number of those cases. You can see in the 1920s and 1930s, the very earliest civil rights activists argued very, very explicitly that accidents where police have made mistakes and innocent people have been killed, those need to be front page issues because people need to know that they're happening. People need to understand why they happened, and that's the best way to sensitize people, to make progress. And at the end of the day, I view the Black Lives Matter movement as a kind of continuation of the civil rights protests that I examine when I look at the 1920s and 1930s and 1940s. Those early civil rights activists were correct that the shining a bright light on these things makes kind of good people sensitive to it and changes police-civilian interaction, police training, civilian behavior toward the police. So is there some inflammatory rhetoric now and then? Yes. Is this a positive movement? I think in the very spirit of the civil rights movement it is. I think we've been moving in the right direction for a long time, but the pace is too slow. So I think the number of police homicides compared to the 1960s or the 1950s or 40s, I think is much smaller, but that doesn't make them, the ones that happen, any less tragic or any less acceptable. So I think we're much more sensitive to race relations in general, but that doesn't mean we are where we should be, and that doesn't mean as a society the work is done. It doesn't mean that political leaders and government leaders and judges and like, it doesn't reduce their obligation to try to address the circumstance. Racial discrimination isn't what it was 100 years ago, when there were quotas, when there were separate water fountains, when African Americans were barred from juries. But that doesn't mean it's not real in 2016, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be addressed in the forms in which it's still pernicious.